5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. All right. It's a privilege to introduce a friend of mine, and our fifth speaker for this week is John Eskola. John Eskola is the CEO and president of Eskola Roofing, a southeastern-based commercial industrial roofing company. Under his leadership, Eskola has grown from 12 employees to more than 350. I was at the airport the other day getting on a plane, and I saw these Eskola trucks, at the airport. It's like a big deal. And he currently serves as a ruling elder at Grace Reformed Bible Presbyterian Church in Greenville, Tennessee. He and his wife, Kim, have 10 children and 9 grandchildren, and we're thankful that he is here to speak to us. Let's applaud him on.
Is that good? Are we good? All right. Thank you. Now it'll be too loud. You can't win. This is like business. This is truly the way it is. It was kind of like the old story where Mike Tyson said everybody has a plan when they go into the first round of the fight and then they get hit. And it's just a fight after that. So, business is very similar. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate all your help with this tonight. So now that we've got the fact that I was the affirmative... One thing you'll learn real quick in business, it never goes the way you planned. Some days are really good and some days are really bad. And then you just hope you get a few in the middle where it's kind of like even keel. But as I said earlier, I'm the CEO of Eskola Roofing in 2004. So just to give you a little more background, I grew up on the roof. I worked with my father. I was 10, 11, 12 years old, picking up trash, loading it in a dump truck. By the way, it didn't dump. We had to dump it out by hand. So it was hard physical work. I am grateful for the few things, and a lot of things that my father taught me, but one thing I am extremely grateful for is the work ethic. My dad taught us what good, hard, Puritan work ethic was. And boy, we had to work and sweat, and we were given nothing, we had to earn it. And that hard work and that ethic has really carried through in many ways. So we were taught that at a very young age. In 2004, my brother and I acquired the assets of the organization from my dad. We restructured it in today's current LLC, and we set a goal. We said, what do we want to do? In 5 years, we want to be a $5 million roofing company. Now, I don't know if that really means anything to anybody or any perspective, but it's a decent business. It's a self-employed business. You don't have a lot of infrastructure in that size of an organization. But in 2009, we had set out on that goal. We completed that goal. The Lord was very gracious. He blessed our efforts. And then we started scaling from there. So by 2023, we were in the top 20 roofing companies in the United States of America. This year, we're projected to be in the top 10. And I would say probably within 3 years, probably top 5. And so that kind of gives you an idea of the scale of our industry is a very fractured industry. There's 27,000 roofing companies. So don't be misled. It's not that hard to get into the top 20, but the top 5 is quite a leap from there. And then the scale at that point gets pretty enormous. But we're working very hard at building an organization that is rooted in biblical principles and that lives out our calling to bring glory to the Lord Jesus Christ. So I remember one time I was at Westminster listening to Brent preach. My family and I grew up there. I can't even remember the message, Brent, but I remember what I took away that day. I went home, and on Monday I walked into the office, and I said, all right, it's easy to listen to that on Sunday, but how do I do it today? Like, how do I very practically live out everything that I was taught that I believe? Undoubtedly. I'm a 6-day creationist. There goes clothespins. You got to love these things. I wasn't quite sure what they're for, but I really was struggling that Monday. How do we live out the gospel of what I believe in a practical way in the real world? And I was trying to connect that connection that I think probably many of us struggle with. And where I was really trying to struggle with, or that what I was wrestling with, wasn't so much my brother and I were devout believers. We could live this out. Don't steal. Love your neighbor. Love God. Live those things out. Obey the law and treat your customers right. Live by integrity in your business. Do what you say you're going to do. Do it for the price you said you would do it. Do it when you said you would do it. It's pretty simple, and yet, how do I get 50 people at that time in an organization that are not all believers to buy into that? And so that was a really difficult week just wrestling with it. And I say difficult in the sense I was really trying to figure out how I'm going to communicate to lost people in a company. I want you to live out my worldview. And that's hard because they don't believe in your worldview. Now, fortunately, the Lord is very gracious. We had a lot of people in the organization that were believers, but the unbelievers were the ones that I was trying to map this out for. And so what we did is we sat down and said, we got to come up with some core values. And we want our core values to represent and really fulfill what we're trying to do. So the first core value we came up with was, I remember the sermon now, Brent. It was about the law. Love God and love your neighbor. I'm making the connection again. I'm 52. Sometimes it takes me a while. But what happened was we were looking at how do we love God. And so we mapped out a core value of quality that said, basically the Bible says we should do everything we do, not for man, but for God. We should do it for the glory of Jesus Christ. So you think about 1 Corinthians 10:9, where it says, whatever you do, whether you eat or drink, do all to the glory of Christ. And so we said, we're going to make sure that whatever we do, we put on a quality product. We give our customers the highest standard that we possibly can in the execution of roofing. And then I said, you know what? And even the unbeliever that comes to work here, he ultimately signs or she signed our employee handbook and said, I'm not going to use drugs while I'm working at Eskola, and I'm going to obey the driving policies at Eskola, and I'm going to follow the safety policies on the roof. I'm not going to go within 6 feet of the edge without being tied off. And you know what? We expect you to put a quality roof on too. And as a non-believer, you can still do that. And so that was our first core value that we set up. Our second core value is customer service, how we love our neighbors, we serve them. So we have 2 customers at Eskola Roofing, an external customer. We provide them customer service. And then an internal customer is our coworker. And our third core value is safety. So we love our coworker by keeping him safe, making sure, hey man, that's dangerous over there. Put your harness on, stay safe. And literally for 15 years now, every year at our State of the Company address, I've told this story. Here's our core values. I came out of church. I was struggling with it on Monday. Here's where they're rooted in. Here's where they come from. And even if you don't go to church and don't believe any of that, you can still put a quality roof on. You can still serve your customers. And you can still be safe. And as long as you're willing to do those things, you can be gainfully employed at Eskola. That's our contractual relationship. We expect you to execute these core values, and then what we want you to do is get paid. So we'll agree to pay you, you agree to do these things. And it's really very simple. I didn't say it was easy. It's not complex, but it can be a difficult thing to execute on a regular basis. Maybe by tomorrow we'll get this thing figured out. I got to keep typing the password in. All right, so our topic for the week is entrepreneurship. The theme verses, I gave you one of them, was 1 Corinthians 10:9. The second one is Genesis 1:28, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, have dominion over the fish in the sea. So it's about taking dominion. And the second or third, Deuteronomy 8:18, you shall remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the power to get wealth, that he may establish what? Whose covenant? His covenant, which he swore to your fathers to this day. So the emphasis here is that the Lord empowers us so that we may establish his covenant in time, place, and history. And so just like we were learning about creation earlier, I would love to see you drive a tank, by the way, Mr. Phillips. I love that in the bio, tank commander. So it's real. It's in history, and it's in time, and it's in place. We execute these things. It's not by accident. You don't sit home on your couch and say, Lord, Lord, please bless me with this great business so I can make this money and give to all the missionaries. It doesn't work like that. You have to get up. You have to go to work. You have to be faithful day after day after day after day. I remember Brent and I were having a discussion one time, and I think I was about 40, so I don't think I was having a midlife crisis. I had too many kids to have a crisis. But they were just hungry, and it just kept me going out the door and going to work and coming home and tucking them in bed and crashing myself and then get up the next morning and go to work. But Brent and I were talking about this, and one thing that he shared with me is he said, John, this is a quote. You can write this one down. Brent Bradley, the kingdom of God moves forward in the mundane things of life. And I think what I was struggling with was 20 years of changing diapers, both on my children at home and my roofers at work, running a daycare at home with my wife Kim and a daycare at work with my brother Ben. And it just seemed endless, and it was just mundane. And it was like, when is it ever going to end? And then one day you wake up, and you've got 9 grandchildren, and you got a company. By the way, the bio says I have 350 employees. Today we currently have 450 on the way to 500. We acquired another company in February with 120 employees, so that would be, 470. And we're about to acquire another one with 45 employees June 30th. So we'll be topping 500 as far as employees. And you don't think that managing 500 people is a difficult task? Come spend a day with John. The phone never stops. It's unbelievable sometimes. And then I hired an HR director. Oh, God. They are angels that the Lord sends from heaven himself to handle HR issues. And so, it's just important to understand it's the mundane activities that we take dominion in, day after day being faithful, and it's the Lord that blesses that faithfulness. There's 2 points I want you to take away from here, specifically. Number 1, we are called to be productive. If you're spending your time just entertaining yourself, you're not being productive. We are called to work. My mom used to say it like this on Saturday mornings. Whether it was school or work or wherever we came back from, on Saturday morning we'd get up and it's like, we're going to go play baseball. Mom says, no, 6 days thou shalt work and on the 7th day rest. Get your work done and you can go play baseball this afternoon. Work always came first. We're called to be productive. By the way, I'm a big baseball fan. I love baseball. I'm not dissing. I played baseball. But I think the thing that's important there is to understand what it is we're focused on pursuing. Productiveness. We're studying creation here this week with Speaker Phillips. And think about that. Our God was a productive God. 6 days he produced. Now, he did it from nothing. And he equips us with all sorts of means around us, raw goods and materials and people and resources and all sorts of opportunity. But at the same time, he modeled for us what production looks like. We are to be creative and be productive. And every day we should get up and think about, how am I going to be productive today? What am I going to be producing? How am I going to do that to the glory of God? And so when you think about business, you start thinking about this idea of entrepreneurship. What I want you to see is that we're also called to be stewards of the Lord's creation. So I'm going to do 2 things here. We're going to define entrepreneurship, and then we're going to move into a few phases of a biblical view of stewardship, work, and man. So the Harvard Business Review says that Howard Stevenson, the professor emeritus at Harvard, is called the Lion of Entrepreneurship. I believe that was by Forbes. He says that entrepreneurship is the pursuing of opportunity beyond resources controlled. Here's a point I want to make, because I think many people have a misconception about what entrepreneurship really is. Spoiler alert, I believe every Christian is called to be entrepreneurial at some level. We're going to talk about that and really try to flush that out and define it here. I don't believe every Christian is called to start a business. They are two very different things. And so let's not misconstrue entrepreneurship or entrepreneurialism or entrepreneurial activity or entrepreneurial thinking with, I got to start a business. Because there are lots of people that start a business that really are not entrepreneurial, and there are a lot of people that are very entrepreneurial that work in a big corporation. Or how about a homemaker in her home that helps design her home and establish the methodologies in her home and the processes so that it's very efficient. That's entrepreneurial. So look at that definition. The pursuing of opportunity. Doesn't say they started a business. And I think Professor Stevenson really hit it out of the park here. Professor Eisenman, also a professor at Harvard, says that the pursuit is a singular focus and the opportunity is new or novel. We're going to define this here in the next couple slides. He says it could be a new product, it could be a new customer for an existing product, or a new process to make it more efficient. So you think about the engineer that works at a big corporation, and all day long he's working on the efficiency. Maybe it's an industrial engineer in an automotive manufacturing plant who's spending his time trying to figure out how to get this widget from 60 seconds in production to 50 seconds. That's entrepreneurial. He's got to focus on this opportunity to improve something in this process, and that's entrepreneurial thinking. And here's what I'm here to tell you. Every one of us in this room can be entrepreneurial at some level. Thinking about not self-centered thinking, but how, like he just said, a new product or a new customer with an old product. So we're going to talk about a couple of those things here. Lastly, he says that the resources controlled implies resource constraint. In other words, that they are limited. So here's a couple things. The entrepreneur looks at a new product. Think about the iPhone, for example. Back in the 90s, I was roofing in Miami, Florida after Hurricane Andrew. Anybody remember Hurricane Andrew? We're all over 40 or 50, right? It literally wiped out Homestead. It wasn't there. It literally I was down there roofing. It looked like there was a 5-mile bulldozer blade, and they just drove it right through Homestead. It wiped out everything. Roof's blown off. I think it was a Cat 5. The damage was just unbelievable. But back in those days, you can imagine, we're scrambling. Resources are limited. You would go to one supply house, and they would get a tractor-trailer load of these nails that we needed, very specific to Miami-Dade hurricane code, and we'd have to nail these nails with these tin caps through the felt paper before we could shingle it and then get an inspector to come out. And you would show up in the morning, and there's a whole line of all of us roofers with our trucks, and you would just hope when you got to the front of the line, they had a few more boxes to sell you. So supply constraint, it was very limited. And we didn't have cell phones in those days. So we have beepers. Does anybody know what a beeper is? Okay, I tell you, I can imagine. Some of you probably don't because you grew up in iPhone age. Beeper kind of looks like this thing here, just a little bit smaller, and it would literally beep, beep, beep. And then a number would appear on it. So back in those days, does anybody know what a payphone is? Okay, so at least we got 2/3 of the kids that understand, right? So you think about the payphones, you rarely see one around, but they used to be everywhere. And you would pull over on the side of the road, and there was a little phone booth, and you'd go in, pull the phone, and you had to drop a dime in. And then you would dial the number and call. Well, you had the number of the beeper, and then you'd hit the pound, and you would put in your number, and then you'd sit there by the payphone and wait for them to call you back. So you can imagine how inefficient that was, right? So here I had a beeper, a roll of dimes in my truck, and when my beeper would go off, my crews knew that if we had an emergency on the job, they would send me, instead of the number, 911. And then the number would follow with the second call. So I knew, pull off immediately, got to make the phone call deal with the issue. Okay, so then you think about Steve Jobs comes along, and iPhone comes out. Now, before that, you had the BlackBerry and other things. But can you imagine how efficient my life got? Let alone, what is it, about 4.2 billion other people on the planet that own an iPhone or something, and he's only got 2 more billion to sell, whatever it is. It was a product that transformed disruptively communication. Because not only did it give us the ability to make phone calls and everything quickly, we could email, text. You guys know way more about it than I do. But I think you get the concept. You think about modular homes. Back in the old days, how did they build a home? Stick by stick, on site, site-built homes. Well, you think about weather and all the influences that make it difficult to be streamlined in your productivity. So then someone comes up with the idea to build homes in a factory, parts of the walls, and they bring it on site, crane it together, and literally bolt it together and modular it together. Well, they were taking the construction process, refining the process to streamline it more. That's entrepreneurial in their thinking. You think about the other one I put on here is a new demographic or a new customer, the frequent flyer card, frequent flyer miles, and then they roll that out. Some business person has this interesting idea to roll it out to rental cars, hotels. So it's a new demographic of a customer. Nobody started a business to do some of those things. This is getting better. I want you to know that I've turned in my resume for Chief Technology Officer at Eskola Roofing several times, and my CFO has rejected it every time. Reject. And I wasn't sure if I wasn't qualified or if he really thought I was a reject. But the entrepreneur is strategic in their thinking. So they think about things in terms of deferrability versus a one-time sale. They think in terms of, instead of project-based, service-based. There's lots of reasons for that, but if you think about recurring revenue. So, back in the day when they were inventing software, I'll just use an example here, roofing estimating software. They used to sell you their software package, and you literally loaded it on your hardware, on your server at your office, paid $10,000, $15,000 for it, whatever it was, and you owned it. But then they got really smart and said, you know what, we're going to move into the SAS, software as a service, and start selling it to you annually. So now it's in the cloud. We don't own it on our server anymore. And guess what we get to do? We have the pleasure of annually writing a check to the same company that we used to own the software. But if you want the update, now you got to move to our annual rate. That's a business idea of recurring revenue. And so if you're thinking about starting a business, one of the things that you should strategically be thinking about is this a one-time project where I got to sell it over and over? Or can I sell it in like life insurance, collect the annuity for years to come? And then you build up that book of business. In the life insurance world, they typically have about a 93% retention rate. You know what that means? If you sell $100,000 of insurance this year, premiums, next year, you start the year, so think about January 1 this year, you start with zero, and you're an insurance salesman, and you go sell $100,000 of life insurance. Next year, $93,000 you start the year with in income. So you sell another $100,000. So $193,000 that year. Anybody good at math? The compounding's pretty good. You drive through many major cities, and besides the banks, who owns the biggest buildings in town? And you see, all their insurance signs up there. Warren Buffett, one of the most famous investors in the world, loves insurance for a lot of reasons. It's great recurring revenue. So you think strategically in that sense. Number two, they see what others don't. So I got a story about a buggy whip here. Can you imagine if it's 1915, moving into 1920, and you are a craftsman, an artisan, a leather worker extraordinaire, making buggy whips for horse and buggies. And you're in New York City, and you're starting to see more Model Ts up and down the road. What are you going to think as an entrepreneur? Uh-oh. Yeah. The first car I saw, I'd have been thinking, uh-oh. But think about that. What just happened to this crowd? He's got a factory. They manufacture these buggy whips. He's been doing wonderful for 25 years. And the two brothers are sitting there saying, what are we going to do, Fred? I don't know, Bill. I don't know. And the one brother says to the other, I'll buy you out. I'll buy your stock in our business. And the other brother says, my brother's crazy. And so he does. He sells his half of the company to his brother, and then he took his capital from that buggy whip business and invested it in Ford Motor Company. What do you think happened to him? He did pretty good. You know what the other brother did? He was an entrepreneur too. He started making leather car seats for Ford Motor Company. He pivoted. He said, I'm a leather worker. I'm not a buggy whip maker. And he pivoted and started making. And then in the Roaring 20s, you know what he pivoted to? We're going to add an ancillary service over here. Women's pocketbooks. They both did extremely well. The point there is you have to think outside the box. See, it's about vision, the pursuit of opportunity. So the third one, here the other point, willing to take risks that others are not willing to take. You know, I put the biblical example up here, 1 Samuel 14. Think about that story. Jonathan and his armor bearer. The Philistines are on the mountain. They're surrounded rock cliffs, very difficult to get up to. And Saul and his priests are sitting there under, I can't remember the exact verse or what it says, but sitting under the tree, and they don't have prophetic vision. In other words, Saul wasn't walking with the Lord at that time. And what happens? Jonathan then acts in faith. And he trusts the Lord that he's going to deliver the victory. And what does he do? He goes up the side of the mountain, takes the garrison, slays 20 men, and they win the victory that day. He was willing to take risk that others were not willing to take. And I tell you, when I think about entrepreneurship, it's all about risk. And we're going to talk a lot this week. I want you to see this seamless thread across 5 lectures of risk. Not foolish risk, not uncalculated risk, but faith-trusting risk. Risk that we trust that God's called us to this place in time and history, and that we're being faithful in what we're doing. We calculate it, we do all the math and the equations, yet we don't waver. We go all in. And one of the slides I've got that I'm going to talk about later on is the Great Commission. Let me let you in on a little secret. It ain't for sissies. It's risky. Disciple the nations. Think about that. It's not small. It's an enormous goal. It's a great goal. And Jesus shared that with 12 men. Disciple the nations. And that message is for us today too. Disciple the nations. Begin with yourself and your family, your church, your community, your state, your country, and the world. Disciple the nations. That's what we're called to do. But it's risky. Think about today. There are people today discipling the nations, missionaries in parts of this world, their heads coming off. Who's ready to sign up? It's risky. But that's what we're called to do. We're called to be faithful. And so when you think about business in the same way, I think that there are many business people that are afraid. And I think fundamentally they're afraid because they struggle with faith. You keep your eye on Jesus Christ and just be faithful in all the mundane things. And don't worry about the risk. Once you've measured it, I'm not talking about foolishness. I'm talking about working through it, and you make a decision, and you pray about it, and you trust the Lord with the results. Here's what's important. Someone asked me one time, I told you earlier about how we've been growing our company, and they said, John, when's enough enough? I bet some of you might have even asked that tonight. When's enough enough? Here's what I'm going to tell you. To understand biblical stewardship, it's the wrong question. Why do I think it's the wrong question? Because when we ask the question, when is enough enough? Here's what we're ultimately saying. Lord, when I have enough, then you can have what's left over. That's not biblical stewardship. Biblical stewardship begins with the concept that it's all the Lord's. And the question we should rather be asking ourselves is not when's enough enough. I mean, when's the last time anybody said to the pastor, man, there's too many people coming to church here, stop preaching. But the minute the businessman starts having success, what do they say? Oh man, when's enough enough? What we should be asking ourselves is, are we being faithful enough? That's the question. Because when we're faithful, then, and we keep our eyes on Jesus, like Hebrews 12 says, keep your eyes on Jesus. He's already won the fight for us. We focus on him. Don't let that sin ensnare you. Don't let it weigh you down. You don't think there's struggles with idolatry and greed and fear and complacency and everything else in a business? Yes, there is. But what I'm telling you is be faithful. Take the risk. If God's called you to do that, when you're faithful, the results of said faithfulness are up to who? God. They're not up to us. We trust the Lord with the results, whatever they end up being. And we just go daily and be faithful. And when we do that, that's how we take dominion. That's how we glorify God. You may go start a business. I've known many, many dear friends of mine that started a business and it didn't succeed. But they were faithful in how they did it. And I've known many people that were super successful that are not faithful at all. We're called to be faithful. Follow Christ. Be faithful in the execution of that. We really got to get this figured out before tomorrow. So they're unwavering in their focus, time management. That's going to be something we talk about a little bit later on. I think it's super critical. It's probably one of the most critical elements of anything that you do entrepreneurially, starting a business, learning to manage your time. I've got some talks about it later on about what's important, what's not, the sense of urgency or the lack thereof. They adapt to changing environments. You know, the entrepreneur is persuasive. And I put down here, they're persuasive both to their customers, because if you don't have customers, well, you're not going to sell anything, but also to their coworkers. And then lastly, I said earlier, simple isn't easy. Here's one of the points I really wanted to flush out tonight. Why should we seek to be entrepreneurs? For freedom. Self-sufficiency. God created us to be creative. Who? I believe that everybody is called to be entrepreneurial. Here's what I want you to understand. I believe our country is fast becoming a nation of slaves, and we need to stand up and regain our independence. One way to do this is through starting small businesses and thinking entrepreneurially. What prevents many people? Fear. Complacent. I wish I had one of those things where, you could roll it out one at a time. I'm sorry, I've already proven the fact I'm not tech savvy. So let's look. You were lucky to get a QR code. Thank you, Asher. You got a PowerPoint. Thank you, Asher. Anybody that works with me knows I've got yellow legal pads. They have a stack of them at the office. And it's funny. My sister Sarah's worked with me for about 15 years now as an estimator. And she'll call me. I get the email. I don't respond to that. I get the text. And then the call comes and says, can you put me on your yellow pad? Because I know the yellow pad gets done. It's all the other electronics that don't happen. So that's a time management lesson. Get a yellow pad and make a list. But fear, complacency, comfort, greed prevents people from all of these entrepreneurial efforts. So a biblical view of stewardship. Here's the definition. It's the conducting, supervising, or managing of something, especially the careful, responsible management of something entrusted to one's care. Stewardship of natural resources, as an example. And the last definition I put down here, biblical stewardship is the faithful outworking of the application of the truth of the word in our lives. We are called to be stewards, and it's the outworking of the scripture in our life. We begin with our view of ownership. And I've talked a lot about risk. Real quick, can I get a time check? How much do I have left? 10 minutes, thank you. So, parable, we're going to go through 8 slides in 10 minutes. Minute a slide. Now you're going to get a real taste of how I work. Fast. So, the parable of the talents. You know, I think it's critical. I was thinking about this literally driving up here today. Matthew 25:14, you think about the parable of the talents. You remember the parable of the 5, the 2, the 1. He hands out the talents, then the master comes back, and he's like, good and faithful servant. You know, you doubled it. You made 5 of the 5, 2 of the 2. And the 1 took and did what? Buried it. Why? He thought his master was harsh. And what did his master say to him? Yeah, worthless. And there's a lot of great spiritual lessons there. I'm just going to give you the practical monetary one. What did his master tell him? He should have done at a minimum. At least put it in the bank. And you know, bankers are pretty risky. And collect interest. In other words, what was the man really afraid of? Risk. He was afraid of his master's harshness, but he was afraid to take risk because of the master's harshness. And what I'm trying to say tonight is the other 2 took risk. You need to be willing to put it on the line. And the parable of the talents has a lot to say about risk. Then the quality of our stewardship is reflected by our execution of the master's will. You think about 1 Peter 4:10. We're all gifted by the Lord uniquely, specially. And all that we have is the gift of the Lord. We're stewards to model our Father's grace and giving. Biblical view of work. I think this is really important. God gave Adam work before the fall. It's not a 4-letter word. Or let me rephrase that. It is a 4-letter word. It's, it's not a bad 4-letter word. It's a good 4-letter word. Work! But think about what it means. God gave Adam work before sin entered the world. It's a glorious thing. And so when we have a good perspective biblically of stewardship, a good perspective of work, we're created to be producers. You know, the Reformation really helped reestablish a good biblical view of work. Luther understood that the tradesman was not a secondary citizen who paid the mortgage for the clergy. Hugh wrote his book, How Should We Then Work? Highly recommend it. Phenomenal work that we should read. And I put Tim Ferriss's book. Has anybody heard of the 4-Hour Work Week book? You know, I think this is one of the problems. Our culture has embraced the idea of leisure as if it was a higher achievement. I'm not going to spend a bunch of time on the Greek idea of that. Here's the point. We're called to work, not to pursue leisure. And the Reformation recaptured that idea when you think about the problems that many people have with a diametrically opposed view of work. So then we need to have a good biblical view of man. Man's made in the image of God. He's a creator, a designer. The value of the person. R.C. Sproul wrote a book. I highly recommend it. Stronger Than Steel. Deals with this whole concept. I read it very early on in my business career. Tried to implement this simple value. There's a story of a steel mill and the struggle with the unions and management. And there's a man started holding Bible studies. And what he exhibited in management was value of the union worker. And he was able to win over many of the union workers. It's a great book. It's contrasted with the Darwinian view, which is the opposite, that man comes from a beast. We believe man was made in the image of God. God's view of man, Genesis 1:27, we're the image bearers of the Lord God. Frederick Taylor had an ungodly view. Does anybody know who Frederick Taylor was? Yes. Round of applause. Very good. Anybody know who Peter Drucker was? Famous business writer, right? Professor, academic, writer, author. Amazing, actually, many of the things. But here's what Drucker said. He said that Taylor, more than Karl Marx, belongs in the pantheon of modern thinking alongside Freud and Darwin. And here's what Taylor said. The worker is nothing more than an ox. Is that a biblical view? Absolutely not. Every individual is made in the image of God, and we should value them. And a business owner, business manager's job, their calling, is to help unleash the value that every one of their people have to the glory of God, to help them discover what God's called them to do, what they're uniquely gifted at, what they're very capable at, to equip them, to resource them, to encourage them, to pray for them, to help them become all that God has made them to be. That's a biblical view of man applied in the business world. And it's the opposite of Frederick Taylor's. So, one of the other things here is a free people are a self-governing people. And the business owner must be self-governing. I got a bunch of statistics afterwards we'll talk about the business owners in early America and the high percentage of them. You wonder why America is such a free nation. There's some coinciding things there besides the biblical principles we were founded upon. But the biblical business person governs themselves. You do not need someone directing your day. You can ask my children how many times I've said, clean the garage. And then, why should I have to tell you that over and over and over? Govern yourself. You already know what you're supposed to do. Be self-directing. Go out and do it. Because I'm going to tell you, as a business owner, there's nobody there saying, hey, you need to do this. Because you're the one coaching and helping other people. And if you're not self-motivated, self-directing, you will not succeed in business. That is a guarantee. You have to be able to be disciplined. I think it's one of the key factors of us being a great nation. Here's the other thing about self-governing. I use the word self-sufficient. What I mean is they just take care of themselves. They don't look to the welfare state to take care of them. They are neither dependent on the state nor the rich. Victor David Hanson wrote extensively about this. One of the books he wrote was called The Dying Citizen, and he talks about this idea of the middle class, the citizen, that helps establish freedom in a country because they're not dependent upon the state nor the rich. So I'm a big advocate for people even being self-employed and starting your own business, because then you are self-sufficient in many, many ways. There's a big lie out here that there's security working for a Fortune 500 company. Our security's in the Lord. Let's get that straight. And so why not take the risk? Start your own business and be free. Because at the end of the day, if you go serve your customers, it is so easy to differentiate yourself today. Time check. Am I out? 15 minutes. How many? 15 more? Max? We could go on for a long time, but I did try to get the conclusion right here. So I put this up here kind of as a point. Everybody like J.R. Tolkien? And I love Tolkien. The Return of the King, third book in the series. Do you remember the Steward of Gondor? Right? And do you remember when Gandalf walks in and he looks at the steward, and the steward's sitting on what? The throne. What had he forgotten? Let's ask the question this way. What was he not? The king. The king was coming back. Are we like the steward of Gondor? Or are we going to faithfully execute our duty to be stewards with the gifts that the Lord's given each and every one of us? To faithfully execute that so that one day when the king returns, we lay it all at his feet. That's what we're working towards. Not for our glory. Let's not forget, we don't sit on the throne. We won't even talk about whether we deserve it or not, because we all know that's not the case. But we all are stewards. If you truly have put your faith and trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, he has bought you with a price. And the price was the blood of the Son of God. The King gave himself for us. Should we not be good stewards? Thank you.